Well, good morning. Welcome to B Cube Sunday morning. It's the third Sunday, so we have Cliff Winnig. And because Cliff needed to have some guests, he had to go to all the people who had helped him bury the bodies. And so, welcome to I'll let Cliff introduce the people, and he can tell you which one brought the shovel and who had the pickup truck and what car wash they washed out the bed of the truck in afterwards. Because it's one thing to know where the bodies are buried. It's the next thing to know, better thing to know where the shovel is that you use to dig the hole. But the it's a fun world. But this is B Cube Sunday morning, and we are coming into the election, and because of that, that's why Cliff has got these folks here. But I just want to remind you: vote, vote. And I can't go like the old Chicago adage because my guests are from Chicago. You remember Mayor Daley's vote early, vote often, I think that was.
You're stealing all my good lines, Bob.
Yeah. Hey, that was that was probably one of the last elections that I honest to God believed that was probably corrupt. Because
the graveyard districts came out in droves.
Do what?
The graveyard districts came out in droves for that.
Hey,
watching a Mayor Daley lose.
You know why they called Landside Lindy? Walking through the graveyard, writing down names. But Cliff,
yeah,
I could go rant all day, and
I am well aware.
They've been very fun to talk to prior to the show, but this is where I say, Cliff, take it away while I go to my preferred spot back in the corner, peering out from beneath the covers that's stretched over two different stools.
Make sure you bring a teddy bear because we're talking politics.
Oh, good. Well, you start talking while I try and I got a different kind of mouse this morning because I'm on my laptop. And it doesn't always do everything I want it to do when I want it to do it and how I want to do it. And gosh,
he got himself off.
That was perfect time.
That's a first. All right. Good morning, everybody. So it is late October, and normally I would think, Halloween theme, maybe discuss horror fiction, something along those lines. But this year, there's an even scarier day coming after Halloween, and that is November 5th, which is Election Day in the United States and terrifying around the world, not just in the U.S. So such is our political system for our species. Maybe not the best political system for our species, but we're going to talk about what science fiction and fantasy have had to say about alternative political systems, which is appropriate for a podcast hosted by the publisher of Alternative Truths. Before we get started, I'm going to lay a few chips on the table for myself, which is I've got here a cup of joe, by which I mean literally a cup of joe. This is the Dark Brandon Dark Roast that I finally came in yesterday from my campaign contribution from a long time ago. And then I've got my Kamala mug. I'm set. I'm ready to discuss politics. And these props will trump any other props.
I'm appreciating the creativity of these campaigns. I did not know there was a Dark Brandon Dark Roast.
Yeah, right?
I've been getting the advertisements for contribute and get Tim Wall's hot dish recipe. Love it.
So anyway, yeah, it was available in red or blue, whichever you liked. Anyway, so my guests are both directly above me on my screen, but C.L. Kagmi is a writer of fiction that has appeared in various places, and she has also written some nonfiction and is very active in religious writings as well. and she can tell you about that if she chooses. But I personally have read a number of her science fiction stories, and they're fabulous. And they can be they're collected. And what's the name of the collection again?
Twice Born.
Twice Born. Yes.
Yep, that's all the stories that were published as of 2021, republished and collected.
Yep. And I will tell, because I forgot to mention it before we went live, I'll just tell my guests that if you put in the private chat a URL to something you want to hawk, eventually Bob will put a QR code like over my face. Probably an improvement this time of day. Okay, Steven Schwartz is also a writer, has written science fiction and erotica and erotic science fiction. And in fact, erotic military space opera that was fantastic. Gay erotic military space opera, which the world really needed and just didn't know it needed. But I digress. Anyway, frequently. That had an interesting political system, which you might even want to talk about that. I have known Steven since we met in Chicago 35 years ago, so it's been a while. Claire also has a Chicago connection, and so this is a Chicago panel, really. So, yeah, I'm the talking QR code guy. Buy my book. That was a comment from Liam in the chat. So, without further ado, before we start talking about science fiction and fantasy government, I want to briefly start with welcome my son to the machine, because we are all familiar with the Democratic machine in Chicago. If you've lived in or visited Texas, I used to live in Texas, you will find that Texas still thinks it's an independent country. It was an independent country for about 3 years before it joined the Union, but Texas state flags are everywhere. And and everyone's talking about Texans and Texan this and Texan that. And if you go to Chicago, you will discover it never was, but it still thinks of itself as a city state. I've never been to another city in America where the city flag was everywhere, like the Chicago's. And you enter Chicago and it'd be like, welcome to Chicago, so-and-so mayor presiding, right? Like the mayor's name is on these plaques and all this stuff. Because you are entering the machine, the Democratic machine politics, which is not as shall we say, smooth running as it has been in the past, but it certainly did function in the mid 20th century for quite a few decades. So why don't we start talking about how everyone, I think, is familiar to the point of ad nauseum at this point in the campaign, how American democracy functions, or Republican functions, right? The Republican democratic system. I'll point out that republic is Latin and democratic is Greek, and they basically mean the same thing. But we have a representative democracy, so we elect people. In Chicago, they elect aldermen or alderwomen. I like to call them alder things. They're kind of like elder things, and a mayor, and they run the city like a machine. And the mayor's job, the main purpose of the mayor of Chicago is to make sure that all the commute streets are clear of ice and snow by rush hour. And if the mayor fails to do that, they do not get reelected. That's, like Mussolini had to make the trains run on time. The mayor of Chicago has to clear the streets for rush hour. So let's talk. I've talked enough. Talk, my wonderful guests who are knowledgeable about politics.
Well, I'll start by saying Chicago, and to a certain extent the Bay Area where I am now, shows one of the great weaknesses of quote unquote representative politics. Because I have never cast a vote for a national office that mattered in the slightest. The narrowest margin for a national race where I've been involved was 16%.
Yeah, that whole electoral college system thing, man.
Well, but it The lowest percentage for party vote that my U.S. congressperson has ever gotten was
Sure.
86% in their district.
Yeah.
Senator,
Yeah.
56%. Electoral votes, there it's a bit lower, but not much. You know,
As someone who's
So
from
we're-
Michigan originally, I have some very strong feelings about the ways in which the U.S. is considered a flawed democracy. Because we have officially that is in the world ranking of democratic systems. They're like, well, you're a flawed democracy. You're not quite like a hybrid regime that's riddled with political violence, but you're not like a good democracy. And I come from Michigan, where 2/3 of the state's population consistently votes blue. But because of gerrymandering, it is considered a swing state, where we can go both electoral college wise and congressionally 50-50. Yeah. And want to hear a fun story about how I accidentally trolled the Supreme Court a couple of years back?
Please, that is completely on topic.
So we had passed a referendum to have an independent commission redistrict Michigan. And this was passed with a large percent of the popular vote for obvious reasons. The state Republican Party, I believe, tried to argue that the petition was not valid because the font size was half a point too small on the petition. You can't make this stuff up. But it got passed, and the U.S. Supreme Court decided to delay its implementation for reasons that I'm still unclear on. So I find out about this. And I, to my surprise, find online a phone number for the Supreme Court. Now, what I had not fully processed was that this was the Friday afternoon of Memorial Day weekend. So I think what happened is that the person who answered the phone when I called was the least experienced intern in the entire judicial branch. So he put me through to the voicemail of the Supreme Court, instead of routing me to whatever voicemail I'm sure he was supposed. So I just get this is the voicemail of the Supreme Court, and then proceed to tell all of my Michigan friends to also call. So I like to imagine that the justices got back from Memorial Day weekend to a lot of very angry voicemails from Michiganders that definitely were never supposed to be routed through to that mailbox. But anyway, I have many feelings about the fact that America is not actually a very good representative democracy. We're officially considered a flawed representative democracy because of our convoluted, not representative systems. And I'll get off my soapbox now.
Well, actually, I'm going to tie this into science fiction, because what we've got here is a system that was designed for the best compromise of it takes 2 to 3 weeks to travel from the extremes of the country to the capital, takes as long for mail to get through, and where population centers were incredibly tight or very dispersed, so that communication time, if someone in government wanted to know what people think on an issue, it would take 6 weeks before they got an answer. And the people in the capital had to make decisions on the basis of very little information or very outdated information. And that's something that we see over and over again. I submit it's why there's so many empires in science fiction and fantasy, because it's the exact same communication gap between here is our capital planet and way over there is the planet where the story is actually happening. And so whoever the local nabob is the representative of the empire, but maybe heroic, corrupt, etc., depending on plot demands. And I think we're seeing that really produces problems in places where, no, I can pick up the phone and call the government and tell them what I think right now, where political news changes so rapidly that why do we have all of these built-in obstructions? Cliff, you are muted, I believe.
Thank you. Sorry. Science fiction has answered that question a couple of places. I'll give one example. There's a Doctor Who episode, four-parter called Vengeance on Varos, where it was a former prison colony, but it was no longer a prison colony, but was run like a prison colony, and they had a governor, and the governor made decisions until the people were unhappy, and then they got to vote on whether to keep the governor or whether to slowly destroy his cell membranes using a device that would do that over time. And so the governor had to stay popular. That was the basis of the decision. But all decisions, they were like people had their television sets had a yes and a no button, and they would vote on all sorts of things. And every time there was a big decision, the governor had to get the entire population of Varos to vote yay or nay on whatever issue. So that was very direct. Say hi to Andy, BQ Press writer and great poet. Anyway, and he's written for other publishers. And so that was one. And another one is the Demarchy in Joan D. Vinge's Outcasts of Heaven's Belt, and which was collected with some other stories in that universe in Heaven Chronicles, where everyone there are demarchs because, it's a real, these are real people. So of course they take the pure democracy and mess it up. So a demarch is, like a rich person who is like someone like Elon Musk, right? And so you get people like that, or like, Mark Zuckerberg, and then they vote on everything, and all the people vote on everything, and it's like direct, you vote on everything. It's not representative democracy, it's radical participatory democracy. And it was that was a universe she co-created with her then husband Werner Vinge, and later ran with it basically on her own. And so that kind of, if you're thinking that's kind of a Werner Vinge style made up government, it is, but it's like her only book that's out of print, and it's really worth hunting down, Heaven Chronicles. Okay, I'm done talking about direct democracy in science fiction. Next topic. Someone want to chime in on that? Does it remind you of any other forms of government? Let's talk about the culture of Ian Banks.
Well, in the cards on the table sense, I'm an anarcho-socialist. That's where I come from politically. I've moved significantly to the left since we first met, Cliff. And that's the Banksian model in many ways. What you're dealing with there are literally ridiculous power differentials. The average citizen of the culture lives on a ship or an orbital with millions or billions of other people, and the ships are independently intelligent and make their own damn decisions.
And are smarter than people, which is a key part of the culture.
And are significantly smarter than the people, yes. And,
but kindly disposed to them.
Yep. And what you get are these essentially quasi-impromptu task forces. In one book, they're referred to as the Interesting Times Gang. That notice a problem, call in their buddies to discuss the problem, work on a solution, good or bad, a solution to the problem, implement the solution, and then go about their lives. It's as if we, as a society, whenever we found a problem, we grabbed 5 people who are either powerful, particularly intelligent, or particularly knowledgeable, told them, okay, get any of your friends together, you want to fix this problem, go fix it.
There's a bit of Plato's Republic in that.
Exactly. It's almost a, government by conscripted oligarchy, except that nobody has the authority to give anyone else any real orders other than social cachet. I think, I being one particularly massive ship, you two being smaller ships should go over there and do this thing. Don't you agree? Because if you don't agree, me and my 47 other buddies are probably going to be less likely to talk to you and do what you want in the future.
Yep.
So it is, in some ways, strictly anarchist. There's no official hierarchy, no official leaders. It is entirely voluntary, which makes it rapidly moving and sometimes prone to collective hallucination.
Mm-hmm. And when they have an out of context problem, it could be a real problem.
Yeah.
So, hi, Karen G. Anderson, another writer, editor, and fellow host of this podcast.
I would love to think that someday we would have the ability. I mean, I'm one of those people who finds the culture utopian, in that I'd love to think that there were enough smarter people out there to solve the problems that I'm not smart enough to solve. But I'd be really interested in seeing how that kind of conscriptive anarchist oligarchy, 3 words that have never appeared in the same sentence in order before, would work on a human level.
So that's the thing, right? I mean, the culture posits an interstellar civilization with fast transportation and fast communication, faster than light. Superhuman intelligence is guiding it. Like, in theory, every person and drone, which was a human level machine intelligence, and mind with a capital M, which are the superhuman intelligences, in theory, they're all equal, right? That they all have an equal voice. In practice, everyone lets the minds do what they want because they know the minds are more capable and long-lived and perspicacious and all that stuff. But it's also a civilization based on an economy of surplus, right? Economy of plenty. And so everything they do within their society is a positive sum game, as opposed to reality, right? And I mean, there are some things in real life that are positive sum games and not zero sum games and negative sum games, but there's a lot that isn't, right? I mean, you look at, say Russia and Ukraine, they're fighting over territory. It is a zero sum game. There is so much territory. When one gets territory, the other loses territory, that sort of thing. Whereas in the culture, well, they need more space. They could build another orbital. They can, explore strange new worlds, right? Seek out new life and new civilizations. We're sliding into Star Trek here. And, so that's an interesting Gedanken experiment, right? That Ian Banks came up with, and then he takes the special circumstances part of the contact and writes book after book about, like, he throws these people into economies where there are shortages and wars over territory and power. And as Carl Sagan would say, to be the momentary master of a tiny corner of a speck, right?
Yeah.
So that takes the stories to the human level. So let's talk about another very popular interstellar series of governments, the Star Trek universe. You have the Federation of Planets. You have the Klingon Empire, which for some reason doesn't have an emperor but has an elected chancellor from an oligarchy. You have the Romulan Star Empire, which is closer to the Roman Republic than the Roman Empire, even though it was originally named for the Roman Empire, because they have a Senate, SPQR. And you have the Cardassians, which are a military run society, and the Bajorans, which they're really a theocracy. A bit like the Tibetans before the Chinese came and took over. So, and I say a bit, I mean a bit. It's not exactly a real world analog, but that's something like it. So let's talk about that. Either culture or Star Trek, compare, contrast.
Interesting question.
Yeah.
We were talking off camera a little bit about why all of those cultures are called empires when the Federation is a federation. And I'm now wondering who decided to translate whatever they call themselves into empire and
Besides Gene
federation.
Roddenberry, you mean?
Yeah, but it's an interesting question. I've been working with religious studies, and in a lot of those, you have the question of what word do you translate one language into another that really informs how you feel about the way the culture is getting talked about in that second language. And so, as you mentioned, a lot of them don't really meet the technical specifications for an empire. So, who decided to call them empires in English or Galactic Standard? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so I guess like in religion, the translation of to the words ancestor worship, for instance, has a certain anthropologically condescending tone to it.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk. There are so many things I'm constantly finding in religious texts where it was translated this way, but that is not even close to how the original culture would have understood that term. And you can exercise a lot of control over people through translation and information flow, because that's a big question that we're facing right now. Right? Is democracy is good, but for it to function, people have to have access to accurate information and be able to identify what accurate information is. So that's kind of a sidetrack there, but I was just thinking about that because I was like, all of these other empires are empires, but they don't meet the description of empires, and someone had to decide to call them empires in English. Yes.
Steven has been making many faces. So
I have a theory, which is going to offend Ian Banks fans possibly, but here we go.
I look forward to it.
We started, before this started, we were having some discussions about the same question. And I think what it boils down to is a division of government types into 3 different categories from the Star Trek universe point of view. There are assemblages of governments from the bottom up. That would be like the Federation of Planets. Everybody had their government on their planet, and then we all get together and talk about it at higher levels. We have empires, where the Klingons or the Romulans or the Cardassians or the whoever went out from their planet and conquered or took over and rule from above a collection of planets. It's a concentration of power. And the third type is where you have this sort of free-floating structure where everybody's a member, and some members may be bigger than others, but in theory, no member is more important than any of the others. And that would be, to pick 2 examples totally at non-random, the Culture, not in Star Trek, or the Borg. And they are collectives.
Yes, or the Q continuum.
Decentralized.
Right? I think it's interesting. Now that I think about it, I'm just now thinking about it. We get introduced to the Borg by Q. And really, the closest analog in meat space, as it were, in Star Trek to the Q continuum has to be the Borg, right? Because the Q continuum is a functioning anarchy they're a collective. And the Borg are... I mean, we always, since the Q can time travel, it could very well be that the Borg eventually evolve into the Q. Once they've absorbed everything.
And here I was thinking that Q was actually the avatar of the General Contact Unit. Why, yes, I'm messing with your mind from the Culture.
Yes, for those unfamiliar with Ian Banks' space opera, Ian M. Banks is how he publishes his science fiction published. His spaceship names are legendarily cool. They are often whole sentences. And they are chosen by the individual mind. So they're kind of the meme war of the spaceships in the Culture. But anyway, so yeah, I mean, the other thing to think about is how they undermine that, right? Like they keep, like the Federation per Star Trek 4 doesn't have money. It sort of did in the original series. And then, you get to Deep Space Nine and you have the Ferengi, which someone mentioned in the chat, and they're all about finance. Ferengi, by the way, is based on the word Ferengi, which is in various Sanskrit-derived languages an epithet that is not complimentary, describing originally Dutch traders, but all European traders. So the Ferengi are kind of how they saw Europeans put into space. So anyway, that's Ferengi, and Ferengi is based on that. So they put money into Deep Space Nine. There's economy and money, and it's clearly capitalism, right? Quark is a capitalist on a capitalist space station under I would say a fascist rule of the Cardassians, because the Cardassians are combining state power with economic power, and working with the Ferengi, who are basically Switzerland, right? They're neutral; they don't care who they're dealing with, as long as they get paid. So, I mean, the individual Ferengi can have opinions about individual people. Like Quark has definite opinions about Cisco versus, Gul Dukat, but that doesn't mean that he's unwilling to work with Gul Dukat, right? So that doesn't, you don't let your opinions get in the way of profit. So the Ferengi have, I don't know what you would call a profit-driven political system, because you have the Tower of Finance and all of that. But they have their little book. It's like Mao's little red book, but it's all, aphorisms about making money. So that's an interesting thing to throw into Star Trek, because it then makes the Federation less, because the Federation had been like the culture. It was an economy of plenty. It had replicators, right? You want a physical object. You want food and other sustenance, whatever. We've got a replicator. We've got holodecks. We've got holosuites. Not much need for money, right? There are resource limitations. Yes, Stephen.
I was going to say, actually, it's ironic that you bring that up here, because there is one thing that replicators can't do, or one significant thing. I've just been watching DS9.
We can't tap dance. Oh, what?
Cisco has a signed baseball.
Right. Yes.
Things with history, things of unique provenance, etc. I'm sure there are things that replicators are not permitted to reproduce. If you walk up to your replicator and say, I would like 4 pounds of explosives and 2 kilograms of heroin, it's going to look at you, beep, say out of order, and call security.
Sure.
Yeah. So, but scarcity, the post-scarcity of the culture or of Star Trek applies to generic objects.
Sure.
Not to handcrafts, objects with history, with provenance.
Yeah. Even,
and I feel like
in the culture. Yes.
That's an important distinction, because it's also a distinction between survival and luxury. Like, if you need food, you're not going to go without food or housing in a world with replicators. If you want some super special item with a very specific history, you might need to pay for it. But no one is, going hungry or dying of exposure in a replicator post-scarcity culture. Unless you strand yourself on a planet, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of, unless you wind up in the sort of situations that special circumstances in the culture winds up, or red shirts in the Star Trek universe wind up in.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm not as familiar with the cultures I am with these other universes, and I'm curious about how resources are managed, because any sort of, anarchist relationship among equals assumes that one of you isn't dependent on the other for survival resources. So I'd be curious if there are relevant things that you think about that.
Well, the mind, you're dependent on the minds.
Right. But, and this is there's a classic bit in one of the novels, I believe it's Surface Detail, where they discuss what the penalty for murder in the culture is. The penalty for murder in the culture is essentially you get followed around by a drone who makes sure you don't do it again.
Everywhere.
That
the rest of your life.
It's like But that doesn't sound like much. Why is that a big deal? It's like, well, if you're a murderer and followed around by a slap drone, you don't get invited to a lot of parties. You are free to go and do things by yourself for the rest of however long your life is. But you are some significant level of social outcast. And yes, every human is dependent on the minds, but a mind, whether it be ship, orbital, whatever, that tried to keep its humans close to it, or prevent a human from leaving it to go somewhere else, would become an instant pariah, and probably shortly thereafter do the rough equivalent of being slap droned out of existence. We're going to put you in a small tub and send you towards Andromeda. Bye.
Yeah, I always wanted to see the bar where all the murderers and their drones hang out. That would be a great scene.
Yeah, I'm glad the culture reached the consensus to ostracize those people, because I was just thinking, I feel like in the current era of social media, that might not be a detriment.
Yeah, so a lot of our science fiction ideas about government kind of run smack into the internet, right? Like, we have a democracy, but it requires voters to be well informed. Well, voters have never been well informed, right? Part of the politics in any democracy is trying to pull the wool over the eyes of voters so that you get their votes. However, those tactics have been refined, shall we say, for the internet age to a degree that is completely enviable by any scoundrel of the past, right? The ability to control the flow of information is so important to pulling the wool over the eyes of people, right?
Something that still frightens me is, I believe at some point in early 2016, there was a Russian intelligence official who was quoted as saying that they had developed the information age equivalent of nuclear weapons. And what's scary is we still don't know exactly what that is. We know that there were a lot of bots from Russian territories that were spreading misinformation, but we don't know if that's the extent of it. And boy, did our information environment get interesting around that time. So the manipulation of information is a very interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, if you're an amoral actor with a lot of time and resources, then you can do a lot in the information age. I'm going to talk also about my favorite television show, science fiction television, which is Babylon 5. Again, the Centauri Republic has an emperor. So, Earth Force goes through Earth Force and the Earth Alliance. The Earth Alliance in particular goes through a political assassination, a new presidential regime. Yes, this person was elected as VP, but now is taking over the information economy using a spy network, controlling the news media, that sort of thing. But also, all of this is connected to some pretty superhuman intelligences. There's a war going on, like a proxy war going on by two superhuman intelligences, which roughly translate to the Michael Moorcock's idea of order of law and chaos, right? You have the Vorlons on the side of law and the shadows on the side of chaos. And so on the one hand, you have different forms of human government, but humanity, the Earth Alliance is really kind of a puppet government for a while, being run by a much more powerful state whose internal structure we don't understand, right? We do not understand the Vorlon or shadow governmental structure at all at any point in the show. We just are on the receiving end of them, right? And at the end of the Shadow War, there's like two representatives, like one Vorlon, which is like clearly all Vorlons, and one Shadow, which is clearly all Shadows, even though they're species made up of separate individuals. So they have some way of hive minding, right, for important decisions. Clearly, like important decisions like how to resolve this war, right? So,
Hive minds are so interesting.
so that's fascinating technology. The idea that you could like hive mind and then break apart again after you as a society have made an important decision.
Yeah. In in one of my universes, there's a hive mind that's very key, and it's interesting to get into because my background is in neuroscience, and this species has a very different view of conflict because they're like, well, if our brains can directly interface and communicate, information and emotions and reach a decision, we just are not having the same kinds of perhaps communication challenges that other species are. And that gets into interesting territory because they have a degree of lack of interest sort of in individual liberty that humans find very disturbing, but they're also like, well, it's because we all participate in the hive mind, so we don't have these, we don't have people who are getting cut out of the information flow, we don't have people who are misguiding the information flow, but as humans who don't have access to that kind of perfect communication, we have a lot of checks and balances we need to consider.
Steven?
Oh, I was going to say that I'm reminded, I don't recall the name of the race of aliens in The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, but it's a species that is riven by intersonan struggles because they have a black and white view of the world. You are correct or you are not correct. You are in consensus or you are not in consensus. And the way that if you are not in consensus, it is resolved is usually something like the consensus eats you. Or if you take enough of the consensus with you, boom, new intersonan war. The other thing I was going to say is that I would argue that to a certain extent, we are existing in a hive mind. It's just that we're polled at extremely long intervals, like roughly in the US 2 to 4 years.
Every 2 to 4 years, yeah.
Yeah.
Or like a hive mind with some really bad wiring because of all the mechanisms that are in place between what the individual neurons, if you will, are doing and what the ultimate outcome is. So
Oh, politics, give us more dopamine so we can work better.
Yes. Can we get some dopamine to get more people to vote? Like, I'm trying to think.
That actually reminded me, have either of you read John Brunner's The Shockwave Rider?
At your recommendation many decades ago.
Good. Glad to know I've been a positive influence. I bring it up, and I apologize. There are mild spoilers here for a 50-year-old book.
More, yeah, 49, I think. But yes, close enough.
Something akin to that.
70s, yeah.
But what he posits in there, in part, is the new reason or the sneaking suspicion that other people know more than you do and have access to information you don't as a major social and psychological stressor. And it is the ability to access secret information that becomes part of the proposal near the end of the book for a complete direct democracy, a plebiscite.
Mm-hmm.
And to give the man credit where credit is due, and a lot of credit is due, he ends it in a beautifully ambiguous way. I encourage it to all of you if you can get past its both highly predictive and highly entertaining view of computer technology.
I am intrigued.
Yep,
but
it's a great book. It predicts the internet more or less. And the concept of the plug-in lifestyle is chilling. I'll note Liam mentioned a great scene in Babylon 5 involving Emperor Catagia of the Centauri Republic, who is clearly modeled on Caligula from the Roman Empire. But I'm going to talk about a little bit of fantasy because I did say we should talk about fantasy. Michael Moorcock, although it's technically science fiction, it's kind of science. It's kind of dying Earth science fantasy. Dancers at the End of Time. You have a functioning anarchy, And it functions, I think, in part because there's like only a few dozen people, right, left on Earth, and that they're all good sports. Like there's a character, and they're immortal and super powerful. They have these rings that connect them to power sources that used to power whole cities. And there's a character, Veta de Goethe, who's basically a romantic Gothic kind of guy, and he regularly commits suicide in a fit of pique, and then eventually one of his friends finds him and resurrects him based on the body, right? And he knows that will happen. So, he misses a few parties. They're like, oh, he's probably off to himself again. So they go and look, and they go to his estate and find, oh, yeah, there he is. He's back. So you have anarchy functioning because nobody wants the reins of power. Everyone can do anything they want. And they like each other for the most part. Even when they're rivals, they just sort of get along. And they have the greatest name in all of fantasy and science fiction literature for any character ever is in that series, I maintain, and it is Gaff the Horse in Tears.
I'm wondering if immortality would inherently make people more affable, because like if you live long enough, you just go, it's not worth it. It's not
Pretty
worth
much.
it.
I mean, they're all thousands of years old. So
I will submit that there's a point. One could argue that series is beyond politics, because politics. I remember aphorism-wise hearing people say politics is the art of the possible, and when practically anything is possible, politics goes out the window. And politics is the art of resolving conflicts and differences.
And diplomacy is the art of saying nice doggy until you can find a rock.
Yes. But
yeah.
There comes a point where if you have people, and this may get back to the hive mind, if you have people in sufficient agreement, you don't really need a political structure, because they will act similarly regardless of the circumstances. This is where politics merges into culture / brainwashing / conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm seeing two kind of underlying themes emerging here. One is the resources, because the types of relationships the different entities have is going to be determined based on who needs whose needs. I actually do mean needs in this case. I don't mean just, I would like to have that tract of land over there. And then there's the matter of information, because do you have accurate information about the other person's intentions? Do you have accurate information about their actions? And those are two.
You even understand what they want.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Oh, I loved that line in Arrivals so much, where they ask, she asks for the translation of war. I believe it was from Sanskrit. And the translator they don't go with describes it as a conflict or disagreement. And she translated as a desire for more cows. And they're like, okay, she's the translator that we got to use, because we got to understand the motivations here.
Yeah. Yeah. So based on the Ted Chiang story, this is the story of your life. So some I'm just going to briefly mention some universes that I was hoping we could get to, and we're coming toward the end. So I want to at least mention them. Joan D. Vinge's Snow Queen universe has some great governments. The planet Tiamat has the Snow Queen and the Summer Queen, and they have a very long winter, many decades-long winter, decades-long summer, and they switch governments entirely. There's the Summer Tribe and the Winter Tribe, and at the time of switching, they literally drown the current monarch and replace her with a different monarch, and they drown her and her consort. And so they have a kind of Corn King thing going. But it doesn't affect you if you happen to be the monarch in the middle of like the 100-year cycle, right? Like you're gonna live out your life normally. It's just if you're stuck at the end, it could be not so much fun. But that's how they do it and ensure that no one from the previous regime tries to hold on to power. And of course, the first novel is about a snow queen who tries to hold on to power in various ways, which was science fiction before, January 6, 2021, and it's no longer science fiction. But anyway, there's that. There's Werner Vinge's Zones of Thought novel, starting with A Fire Upon the Deep. And I'm thinking particularly Deepness in the Sky, which is in the slow zone where faster than light travel is not possible. So communication is slow. Travel is decades long. And the only functioning government you have that lasts for centuries is the Cheng Ho, and they are a Ferengi style. They trade, they make money. They're a fleet of trading ships, and they go from planet to planet selling stuff. And they broadcast, because civilizations collapse so frequently, they broadcast basic info on technologies over radio so that by the time they reach your planet, you have a sufficient level of technological advancement to be a customer. It's not altruism. It's they want someone they can sell to. It's the worst thing is traveling for decades over many light years and arriving to find that they've nuked themselves back to the Stone Age, and now you can't sell them anything.
I just thought of another model that's worth discussing. We don't have much time left, but Neil Stephenson's Files from a Diamond Age is a very interesting concept because they're basically geographically distributed nations where there's a basic set of accords governing relations between unnationed individuals and nations. But then after that, you basically opt in to the nation or culture or file that you would like to be a member of and choose which one's laws to follow, which is interesting because then the nations gain or lose power according to what membership they attract. There's a lot of freedom in that one, which I appreciate because you have people in these cities who are going, okay, which of these cultures do I want to live under that have their own globally dispersed networks? But it also, again, does depend on the assumption that there is global distribution of resources. They have something like replicators, so there isn't a lot of conflict between geographic areas for that reason. But it's an interesting concept, the geographically dispersed nations.
Yeah. There have been proposals I've seen for redividing the U.S. into to loop all the way back to the beginning, so that the Electoral College is not by states, but by professions, by classes, and any one of a number of different ways to slice up a population to ensure or to try and ensure the same level of diversity that the Electoral College was in part intended to produce. I had someone recently point out that in an odd sort of way, the Electoral College is now being treated like a DEI initiative.
Yeah.
We have
like
to
that.
the diversity of the population of
Wyoming,
even though it is smaller than excuse me, I think it's slightly larger now, but roughly the same
about
size.
the same size as the District of Columbia in terms of
as the city I live in.
Yeah.
In Oakland, California, which is third largest city in our particular conurbation.
Yeah, our city is bigger. I'm in San Jose. That we're much bigger than Wyoming.
Yeah.
I'm gonna second what Cheryl's saying in the chat, which is, what if we just got rid of electoral colleges altogether and saw how that went? Just having everybody's
just give it a shot.
Yeah.
Another couple of governments. Obviously, we haven't discussed Star Wars, which is a big Republic to Empire to Republic to First Order to Last Order to High Republic to Low Republic to really filthy Republic. To paraphrase Professor Shickley.
I will
University
point,
of Southern North Dakota at Hoogle. Yes.
if I recall correctly, and forgive me if I am wrong, but the Roman Republic still firmly believed it was a republic well into the imperial era.
Sure.
Something calling itself a republic is not necessarily an indication that a capital R republic is not any indication that it's a lowercase r republic.
Sure.
And I think Star Wars is sort of...
It is an important history lesson that the Roman Empire came after the Republic, not the other way around, as a lot of people assume.
Sure. I didn't know anyone assumed that.
I've seen it.
Really?
Yeah. Speaking of lack of information.
Speaking of empires, there's, of course, Isaac Asimov's Foundation universe, which shows the empire collapse and the rebuilding. And in the early stories, it absolutely shows Emperor Cleon having the power of instant life and death, right? Like he can kill you if he's mad at you, if he has a fit of pique. And so this is presented as, this is civilization, right? Like, and anarchy's even worse, I'm like, oh God, right? So, and then of course there's the mule, which is direct government by mind control. And then Alistair Reynolds has had a series of governments, like in his Revelation Space universe. There are the conjoiners, who are linked to a hive mind, but also people. And he takes us in one of the books into their heads. And so you know what it's like. But everyone else thinks of them kind of like, they call them the spiders, right? They're not looked down well. And then there's a bunch of there are some attempts to have like oligarchies and democracies and things like that, but he keeps going to these totalitarian governments. And I in my younger days, I met him at a World Science Fiction Convention around 20 odd years ago. And I was like, why do you keep doing these totalitarian governments? Do you really think people in the future are going to keep going for totalitarian governments? I was a little naive then, because since then he's right. But at the time it seemed like a reasonable question, and he was like, they're just fun to write. I like doing it. So
there's the joke that evolution is really fond of crabs because things keep evolving into crab-like forms, and it seems, unfortunately, political evolution seems to really love its totalitarian and autocratic systems.
And I should also mention Neil Asher's Polity universe, which does have a polity on the human side, but also has giant space crabs, the Praetor, and their government is the big crabs rule, right? And eat the little crabs and the little humans and anything else they want to eat because they're ruling, because they're the big crabs. So, yeah, government by large, like physical size. The Fated Sun trilogy by C.J. Cherryh has a similar kind of species. They're humanoid, but you become like the little young ones are completely expendable. But if you live long enough, you become like this large creature, sort of vaguely humanoid creature who loses mobility because they're aliens, but they gain all the political power. 100% of the political power it's a gerontocracy. And so, but they're also physically larger than the young ones, even though they can't chase them down. They can, squash them or whatever if they want. So there's that, right? And then there's another species that's humanoid that is, they're basically homeless mercenaries. They don't really go to their home world, but they serve as mercenaries for other cultures. They're soldiers. So there's that. But I think the return of Bob means that we are out of time. So I'm going to, first of all, ask my guests if they have any final thoughts for today. Could be based on this discussion, could be based on the pre-chat. And also, please mention a book or other project that you would like to highlight. Take it away, whoever.
All right. My takeaways from this discussion are: keep an eye on who's controlling your survival resources and who's controlling your information, because you're not going to make accurate conclusions about one without the other. And my book project to highlight for the moment is I do have a new project that's not ready to be announced yet. My book project to announce for the moment is the Twice Born collection of short stories, which is a diverse collection of short stories that happen mostly in the same universe and is available from my pen name that you conveniently see in the corner there. Steve?
This is vaguely related to what we've been saying, but personal pet peeve. I'm sorry, but if you have centralized your entire ruling government on one planet, see Trantor, I've forgotten what the Star Wars equivalent
Coruscant.
Coruscant, etc. A, you're too big. B, you're headed rapidly down the slide to totalitarianism. And C, you are so vulnerable to a decapitation strike, it isn't even funny. Get it together and distribute your government, please.
This happens in Star Wars Movie 7. Apparently, J.J. Abrams wanted to blow up Coruscant, and the Lucasfilm story group said no. So they moved the New Republic seat of government to a Coruscant clone world that they just made up for that one movie so they could blow it up.
That sounds depressingly familiar.
Mm.
And I'm currently between projects, so I don't have anything particular to hype at the moment. I tried to see if the story you referred to earlier was still in print, but it is not, as far as I can tell.
It is called Leashed Steel. Say that 5 times fast.
It came out from Circlet Press in the book Wired Hard 2.
Worth seeking out in your favorite used bookstore or online. In the meantime, expand that thing to a novel. You keep threatening to do that, and I want you to do that.
It would have been very suitable for this podcast had I managed to do so.
Yes, but this is, I suspect, only the first of multiple podcasts in the series of discussing politics and science fiction and fantasy. So there is still time for you to expand that into a novel, because I would really like to. I'd like to see how the government works in this, militaristic society. And there's also, oh my gosh, the Honorverse by David Weber, right, where he decided, as he said in an interview, decided just for fun that the good guys should be the royalists and the bad guys should be the democracy. So you have, so that's the situation, right, in that universe.
I will pitch someone else's book, but he's dead, so it's okay. Relevant to this discussion, if you want to start reading in the culture, a book about politics, Player of Games by Ian M. Banks.
Yeah, it's a good starter.
It is an excellent way to start and completely relevant.
And it's about government. It's a genderocracy, right? Because there's like 3 genders in that species, and one of them is
3 genders, military government by
game.
It is one of only 2 novels I can think of where the government is essentially decided by how well you play a game.
Yep. Which
the
is,
other
of course, a political simulation game. But yeah. Yeah, it's like as if the chess champions ruled the world.
Oh, now I want to see how well or badly that would go.
Yeah, it didn't go well. And it was in one of the Magellanic Clouds. They'd taken over one of the Magellanic Clouds. So, yeah. And there's so much more we could talk about. Oh, my gosh. And we didn't even talk about Tolkien and his whole, like, Divine Right of Kings thing that he's got going there. And we didn't talk about Elric of Melniboné, which is, the emperor who decides to sack his own capital city. The thing about the Elric books and a lot of Michael Moorcock's fiction is it talks about the futility of empire over time, which is also a big theme in Doctor Who, because he can time travel. He can see the futility of these empires rise and fall. The only empire that doesn't fall is, of course, Gallifrey, until it does.
Hey, Cliff.
So, yeah, I'll stop talking now, Bob. Yes, I saw that.
But
your sound is cutting out a bit, Bob.
oh, okay. Well, I'm going to have to do the same because I am at a convention
and I have have to go to my next panel and be a little late, but I'd rather be late and have the joy of listening to you guys' wonderful conversation. And it was indeed wonderful, and I thank you all for showing up. But at this point, I have to say goodbye. So this is where I urge you to say goodbye, and here we go.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you for